Why something versus nothing? Sean Carroll versus Bergson. Let's take a look. The theory of matter, to quote Bergson from Matter Memory, is an attempt to find the reality hidden beneath customary images, which are entirely relative to our needs, that is, the needs of the body. This profound statement has never been assimilated, never, not by physics, perception, even ecological psychology, memory, cognition, theories of consciousness. This statement has to sink in. So watching this video of Sean Carroll's discussion with Doris Sowell, how the brain turns vision into the world. So essentially around the question of the hard problem. Sean mentioned this paper at 5500, wondering if the hard problem is simply in the same class, quote unquote, as this problem. Why is there something rather than nothing? To him, both problems unanswerable. In this series, the hard problem definitely answerable, but you've got to be in the right metaphysic. He also noted, we don't need new physical laws to explain consciousness. That's putting the cart before the horse. Yet, he's just wandered into the most profound metaphysical problem that there is, one Bergson spent 26 pages on in Creative Evolution, because of its implications for science. So let's see what Sean had to say. He reveals his ultimate position rather early on. Quote, the nationalness of this impulse to ask whether the universe exists does not imply that the question is coherent or answerable. It goes on, nevertheless, we can make some progress on the question of why reality exists, both by carefully considering what it might mean to obtain a convincing answer and by looking at what modern physics and cosmology have taught us about the nature of the universe, whose existence we are trying to explain. The most promising answer to date is that the existence of the universe is unlikely to be the kind of thing that is a reason why. To go on, in the second sense of explanation, accounting for properties of nature by appeal to deeper principles, we might hope to find purchase. Perhaps it is the minimal imaginable universe, or the most symmetric, or the most elegant, or even the only possible universe, presumably subject to some reasonable conditions. If some such principle were to be found, we would still have to worry that the question is simply kicked up a level. Why does the universe satisfy this particular criterion? He goes on. This kind of worry generalizes into a concern about explanatory regression. Given any purported reason why reality exists, why is that reason valid? One option, following Leibniz and others, is that we reach a level at which further explanation is not required because something is necessarily true. Now, Sean is not impressed by the principle of sufficient reason of Leibniz. Something is necessarily true. But we'll see, neither is Bergson. At the other end of the spectrum, explanations might bottom out with a brute fact. Something simply is the case without further reason, even though it didn't necessarily have to be that way. Given these considerations, there's a list of options that might conceivably qualify as an answer to why is there something rather than nothing. And his list, creation, metaverse, principle, coherence, brute fact. For creation, there is something apart from physical reality which brings it into existence. God, for example. Metaverse. Just as we can sometimes explain events within the universe by appeal to a causal web, describing the universe as a whole, perhaps what we think of as reality is part of a larger context, a metaverse, that could help explain the existence and properties of our universe. He says we're imagining here something more profound than the traditional cosmological multiverse, which is just a universe in which conditions are very different in different regions of space-time. Then principle. There is something special about reality in that it satisfies some underlying principle, perhaps of simplicity or beauty. but we already know he already sees the explanatory regression problem there. Coherence. Perhaps the concept of nothingness is incoherent, and the possibility of reality not existing was never actually a viable option. And then brute fact. Reality itself simply exists in the way that it does, without further explanation. And he will go through each of these. Creation. To quote, while a creator could explain the existence of a universe, we are left to explain the existence of a creator. In order to avoid explanatory regression, it is tempting to say that the creator explains his own existence, but then we can ask why the universe couldn't have done the same thing. The conclusion is that invoking a creator does not provide us any escape from the need to posit something that simply exists because it does, without further reasons to which we can appeal. The metaverse. But as the metaverse itself is no reason to be a necessarily existent thing, and because dynamical processes within it cannot causally account for the creation of our universe, friends, as the different elements of the metaverse are non-interacting by hypothesis, unfriends, it does not directly provide an answer to the question of why there's something rather than nothing. Principle. He says such an answer would again face the explanatory regression problem, as noted, but the existence of such a principle could arguably serve to soften the blow of the universe not being unique or necessary. Then coherence. One option we haven't considered in detail is the idea that nothing exists might not, despite the seeming naturalness of the formulation, actually be a coherent idea. We are once again challenged to think beyond our experience of objects within the physical world, where it is very sensible to imagine that an existent thing, say the desk on which I am typing, could counterfactually have not existed. So perhaps the universe exists simply because there was no coherent alternative. So this is about as close as Sean is going to come to actually examining this particular question, this notion, the coherence. So unfortunately, it's going to be a no cigar vis-a-vis Bergson. He goes on, suggesting this possibility requires that we look beyond the naive metaphor of a reality chooser, among whose potential options was to choose nothing. Perhaps our language and modes of thought are tricking us, that they are, and existence is something that is metaphysically unavoidable. In that case, some form of reality would be necessary. Even if the specific form were left unexplained, we would still face the challenge of understanding our actual universe. Brute fact. Every attempt to answer the question why there is something rather than nothing ultimately grounds in a brute fact, a feature of reality that is no further explanation. The universe is not unique, and there are no necessary beings, even if we decide that the concept of nothingness is incoherent. At least some properties of our particular universe are ultimately contingent. By the standards of modern science, it is extremely hard to see what could possibly qualify as a final and conclusive reason why the universe exists. Ending with, last sentence of the article, what we can't do is demand of the universe that there be something we humans would recognize as a satisfactory reason for its existence. So for Sean, an answer to the coherence of the question of nothing is of little consequence. Physics, science, the theory of consciousness all march right along, unaffected. For Bergson, the answer to this question has enormous consequences. I must set again the background, done it before, apologize for the repeat, the origin and perception of the classic metaphysic. In the indivisibly transforming field, universal field in which the body is embedded, in which the infinite is placed, our perception must parse out objects and their motions. Objects in which the body can act, to lift a bottle, to shake a rattle. In truth, the field is a globally transforming whole in which objects and their motions are changes or transformations of state within this global transformation. But this initial perceptual partition, objects, motions, is gradually conceptually rarefied. it becomes an abstract space. So picturing our universe as this concrete extensity, then we impose over it this abstract continuum, the 3D continuum of points, positions. It's equally a principle of infinite divisibility. Time, the fourth dimension of this abstract space, becomes a series of instants. As I move the bottle across the continuum, it crosses this trajectory is conceived as a series of points, each point corresponding to an instant of time. So time becomes the fourth dimension. Each point or instant is equivalent to all of space. Each cube, so to speak, with the duration of a mathematical point. When the infinite division is conceived to end, so to speak, you're at a mathematical point. It is the duration of a mathematical point. This treatment of motion is, firstly, an infinite regress. Between each pair of points, one can place a new line of points. Again, a new infinitely divisible line, the infinitely divisible dimension. And it's an absurdity. For motion is now treated as a series of immobilities. Yet this is the framework that underlies our science and our mathematics. And so he begins the discussion of nothing in creative evolution. To quote, "Such is the most striking of the two illusions we wish to examine. It consists in supposing that we can think of the unstable by means of the stable, the moving by means of the immobile. That is our absurdity. Motion is a series of immobilities. The other illusion is akin to the first. It has the same origin, being also due to the fact that we import into speculation a procedure made for practice. All action aims at getting something that we feel the want of, or at creating something that does not yet exist. In this very special sense, it fills a void and goes from the empty to the full, from an absence to a presence, from the unreal to the real. So, the problem of the not, of nothing, has the same origin as that of the classic metaphysic, the abstract space. Both derive from our need to act. But this is not the source of real knowledge, what Bergson calls speculation, real knowledge. That is, not an understanding simply for the sake of acting on something, but immersive, participative union with that thing. That, basically intuition, is real knowledge. So he notes, just as we pass from the immobile to the moving, we must make use of the void in order to think of the full. By the way, my page number here is from this Kindle version of Creative Evolution. He recalls his analysis of disorder, just previous to these pages, where he argued that in reality, what we call a disorder is always just a different form of order, an order we did not expect. He says we must face it in itself, in the radically false conception which it implies of negation, of the void and of the not. Then says philosophy has not paid much attention to the idea of the not, yet, he says, famous quote, "I have no sooner commenced to philosophize than I ask myself why I exist and why the universe exists." And like Carroll, and if I refer to a principle immanent or transcendent that supports it or creates it, the same problem recurs. Whence comes it? And how can it be understood that anything exists? How? Why does this principle exist rather than nothing? He says, now if I push these questions aside and go straight to what lies behind them, this is what I find. The existence appears to me like a conquest over nothing. I say to myself that there might be, that indeed there ought to be nothing, and then I wonder that there is something. Now in Sean's terms, we're beginning to entertain the counterfactual. To quote, or yet again, if something has always existed, nothing must have always served as a substratum or receptacle, and is therefore eternally prior. A glass may have always been full, but the liquid it contains nevertheless fills a void. So he notes, I cannot get rid of the idea that the full is an embroidery on the canvas of the void. We have to clear this mystery up, he says, if we are to put duration and free choice at the base of things, another dynamically, indivisibly flowing time or becoming in which there is inherent creativity. This is the crux. On our understanding of nothing hangs the possibility of science acknowledging real, concrete time and indivisible and creative flow, where time is a force, not the, quote, time, unquote, of the classic metaphysic. To quote Bergson at the very beginning of creative evolution, is the very essence of mechanism, which Sean is the proponent. To consider as metaphorical every expression which attributes to time an effective action. Going on, he says, for the disdain of metaphysics for all reality that endures comes precisely from this, that it reaches being only by passing through not being, and that an existence which endures seems to it, that is to metaphysics, not strong enough to conquer non-existence and itself posit itself. At this point, he anticipates his later discussion of Plato and Greek science and the transition to Galileo, Descartes, Leibniz, Spinoza, which we've described. Did so in number 91, Stella Maris, which this particular video should be considered a companion to thereof. Stella Maris being on the problem of mathematical existence, the reality of mathematical concepts. Also, Kant versus the wasp. So in that diagram we have there on the right, we were beginning with Plato and the Greek science, quote unquote, of reality, and the transition to a new science via Galileo and Descartes, and then philosophy's attempt to leave the Greeks and Plato, Aristotle, and embrace the new science via Spinoza, Leibniz, as well as Descartes. And finally, with a bit more modification from Kant, essentially our current state, but never truly leaving Plato. So he says, it is for this reason especially that it, that is metaphysics, math, physics, is inclined to endow true being with a logical, not a psychological, nor a physical existence for that matter. For the nature of a purely logical existence is such that it seems to be self-sufficient and to posit itself by the effect alone of the force immanent in truth. He says, if I ask myself why bodies or minds exist rather than nothing, I find no answer, but that a logical principle such as A equals A should have the power of creating itself, triumphing over the not throughout eternity, seems to be natural. An example he gives, a circle drawn with chalk on a blackboard that is very physically is a thing which needs explanation. This entirely physical existence has not by itself wherewith to vanquish non-existence. But the logical essence of the circle, that is to say, the possibility of drawing it according to a certain law, in short, its definition, its equation, is a thing which appears to me eternal. It has neither place nor date, for nowhere, at no moment, has the drawing of a circle begun to be possible. So he notes, if the principle of all things exists after an axiom or mathematical definition, things themselves must go forth like the applications of an axiom, with no place for efficient causality understood in the sense of free choice. Such are the conclusions of Spinoza or Leibniz, and such indeed has been their genesis. Basically, the genesis in the Platonic. So he's not buying, as I noted earlier on, Leibniz, which he sees as simply a reflection of the Platonian basis. Another thing, about 30 pages later on, it's worth noting, it's aligned with this. He says, the affirmation of a reality implies the simultaneous affirmation of all the degrees of reality intermediate between it and nothing, if we believe in nothing. We cannot affirm the number 10 without thereby affirming the existence of the number 9, 8, 7. In short, the whole interval between 10 and 0. With suprasensible ideas and infrasensible non-being, so our mathematical ideas would be suprasensible, and non-being, which cannot be sensed, is infrasensible, you now have to reconstruct the sensible world with all its qualia, you might note. You can only do so if you postulate a kind of metaphysical necessity in virtue of which the confronting of this all with this zero is equivalent to the affirmation, again, of all the degrees of reality that measure the interval between them. So we know it's continuing in our original flow. Now, if we could prove that the idea of the not, in the sense in which we take it, when we oppose it to that of existence, is a pseudo-idea, the problems that are raised around it would become pseudo-problems. The hypothesis of an absolute that acts freely, that in an immanent sense endures, that is, the duration of time, indivisible flow, would no longer raise up intellectual prejudices. This begins 9 pages of analysis, as only Bergson can do, showing that negation is a pseudo-idea. Again, no positive reality. To sum up, for a mind which should follow purely and simply the thread of experience, there would be no void, no not, even relative or partial, no possible negation. Such a mind would see facts succeed facts, states succeed states, things succeed things. Our kitty exemplifies this. What it would note at each moment would be things existing. It would never affirm anything but the existence of the present. But endow this mind with a memory, and especially with the desire to dwell on the past. It will no longer only note the present state of the passing reality, it will represent the passing as a change, and therefore contrast it to what has been and what is. It will quickly rise to the idea of the possible in general. It will thus be shunted onto the siding of negation. And the coffee cup is negated, gone. If you're a thinking kitty with the cognitive capacity for negation. So facts succeed facts, states succeed states. Yes, this sounds almost like Sean's "you always end at brute facts" conclusion, and is obviously going entirely beyond it. So Bergson then shows how the concept of the possible leads to that of annihilation and then to negation. So he says, the greatest philosophic difficulties arise from the fact that the forms of human action venture outside of their proper sphere. We are made in order to act, as much as and more than in order to think, or rather, when we follow the bent of our nature, it is in order to act that we think. It is therefore no wonder that the habits of action give their tone to those of thought. But this analysis, this warning, isn't totally ignored by the physicist and the psychologist. This is the implication of the famous 4 E's, embodied, inactive, embedded, etc., and completely missed. Again, we take our extensity picture, the origin of the physics fundamental framework, the classic metaphysic, the very basis of mathematics, and its correlated concept of nothing is never questioned or examined, but it has its origin in our embodied embedded action. The coordinate system of points inherited from Descartes. This framework is an ideal limit of the concrete, indivisibly transforming world. A limit never reached, though matter tends to this ideal limit, hence the effectivity of physics to a point, but it's never reached. It has no positive reality. I place the total blame on this lack, on philosophy, on the burial of Bergson. He goes on, it is in order to act that we think. Our action thus proceeds from nothing to something. Thus the idea of nothing. This long analysis has been necessary, he says, to show that a self-sufficient reality is not necessarily a reality foreign to duration. to real time, to concrete, indivisibly flowing time. In other words, we can break from the Platonic realm of ideas, and only somewhat modified by Galileo, Descartes, and also Spinoza, Leibniz, and only slightly more modified by Kant. We can conceive of a continuously becoming creative universe with a far more firm basis than that from the realms of Plato. If we pass, consciously or unconsciously, through the idea of the not in order to reach that of being, the being to which we come is a logical or mathematical essence, therefore non-temporal. And consequently, the static conception of the real is forced upon us. Everything appears to be given once for all, in eternity, for Plato, as in our 4D space-time block of relativity, which people have great affinity for. The physical will be defined by the logical. Beneath the changing phenomena will appear to us, by transparence, a closed system of concepts subordinated to and coordinated with each other. Science, understood as a system of concepts, will be more real than the sensible reality. And this is where we are today. More real than the sensible reality, the mathematical concepts. Recall the physicist's comments we noted earlier in number 91 with Stella Morris on the problem with the reality of mathematics. The physicist was commenting on this YouTube, where the YouTuber Inductica was arguing that we need to go back to more concrete envisioning of forces and matter. That is, in the case of waves, well, normally waves are a disturbance propagated through a medium. The physicist said, fundamental field entities are not based on a waving of anything. In fact, once you give on such literal models and allow, for example, for quantum entities to be represented as state vectors in a Hilbert space, the modern and correct view, as it turns out, the whole notion of waving of something becomes almost obsolete. And he goes on, it is clear, talking to the Inductica, it is clear that you are working under a category here. You wish to take an exposition, such as the description of physical entities at one time given as waves, for the object itself. There is no other ontology than the wave function of objects. That is Schrödinger's mathematical statement of the wave function, as I explain, best explained by objects not involving waves in the first place. So, what we're looking at there is not waves. They're not waves, and there's no medium through which a disturbance is being propagated. Again, the mathematics more real than the sensible reality. Actually grasping the concrete physical forces involved, gone. Now, Sean, we noticed, said this, we don't need new physical laws to explain consciousness. That's putting the cart before the horse. But the horse, in my opinion, that goes in front is physics' understanding of its own basis, its own metaphysical basis, which happens to be essential for the theory of consciousness as well. So Bergson says, but we must accustom ourselves to think being directly, without making a detour, without first appealing to the phantom of the not, which interposes itself between it and us. We must strive to see in order to see, and no longer see in order to act. Then the absolute is revealed very near to us. The absolute we discussed in number 91. And in a certain measure, in us, it is of a psychological and not a mathematical or logical essence. So it's of a psychological and not a mathematical nor logical essence. He is arguing for the need for intuition in addition to intellect. To intellect, in short, he says, there will be added intuition. He's not replacing intellect, a common misconception of Bergson. He's adding intuition to it. What you drag out via intuition from the absolute, you still have to form via the intellect. Again, I go back to this favorite picture. Instinct, a form of intuition, how the wasp knows the 9 precise points in the caterpillar to sting, to paralyze it, so it stays alive and serves as live food for its young. And the wasp knows this by sympathy. Wasp and caterpillars are two activities, two transformations in the global transformation. Transfers of state in the universal field, and which is a whole sympathetic unto itself. So he says this other knowledge, if it is possible, is practically useless. I will note, well, I'll take a little bit of issue there because this intuition proves pretty useful to the wasp. It will not extend our empire over nature. It will even go against certain natural aspirations of the intellect. But if it succeeds, it is reality itself that will hold a firm embrace. Yes, but it will certainly balance things out, even if practically useless, which I doubt. He is aware of the problem. He can sympathize with our physicist. He says, the more physics progresses, the more it shows the impossibility of representing the properties of ether or electricity, the probable base of all bodies, on the model of the properties of matter as we perceive. Hence why we're kind of stuck with just pure mathematics, with the Dirac equation, the wave equation, unvisualizable, shall we say, in terms of forces yet. But we can't sit there. Equally, physics cannot unconsciously echo the metaphysical tones of Plato and just sit there. Postscript. Repeat. A theory of matter is an attempt to find the reality hidden beneath customary images which are entirely relative to our needs. The classic metaphysic and the reality of nothing. Until physics understands this, registers this, it will wander. Until the theory of consciousness understands this, registers this, it too will wander. So, again, take a look at this book for more discussion on Bergson, Gibson consciousness. Next we'll see. Till then, signing off.